there is a lot of dilution going on in these fjords. It's a complex water mass transformation. So the fresh water that comes out of these fjords is spread around at certain depths that vary from fjord to fjord, and are really mixed with the ambient water masses. So my name is Morven Muilwijk. I'm a postdoc at the Norwegian Polar Institute in Tromsø. And today we'll be talking about some of the work that I did while I was a PhD at the University of Bergen.
I was super excited when I saw your paper coming out, because it's about how water gets transformed within a fjord. And now for me, working on the ocean modeling side, this is of course super relevant, because we have all this ice melting at the Greenland coastal margins, and then it goes into the ocean. But before it does that, a lot of stuff happens in the fjord. And this is kind of hard to reflect in our large scale ocean models, because they just don't resolve fjords. So we need to think about like how to put that into the models. And I think your paper is just a brilliant start to like kick off an investigation to go on with like the parameterizations for the fjord mixing that we're having.
So currently in many of these models, this is done very simple. Like fresh water is added, pretty much like runoff from land or river runoff at the top of the ocean.
And that kind of induces a lot of issues, because if you don't put the fresh water into the right height, then it affects like the stratification, the circulation, and sometimes by accident you shut the AMOC off just because you dumped your fresh water in the wrong place. So this is really an issue, and quite
so how it's done is really important. So at what depth and what are the properties that come out of these fjords? So it's not just like, we know that there's a lot of water mass transformation occurring in these fjords, and that's really what we try. Okay, we investigate this in depth in this one fjord, and then these results might be useful. So what we're doing in this study is that we're investigating the export of ice sheet meltwater in this one specific fjord. And we're focusing on Upernavik Fjord, which is in northwest Greenland. And the exciting part there is that this is one of the first oceanographic studies of this fjord system. And it's quite a major fjord system, as 5 large terminating glaciers at the head of the fjord. And it's an important one.
Can you talk a bit more about like the data set you're having?
Yes. So we use a very exciting data set. It's 6 years that we have of CTD profiles from Upernavik, which is already quite rare. So there's 3 cruises that are involved with this, and then we complement with these airborne expendable CTD probes from the OMG project. So this is a NASA project, Oceans Melting Greenland. Really nice data set. And the good thing about this data set, which is actually quite critical for our study, is that we have observations from within the fjord and outside the fjord on the continental shelf at the same time. So we compare shelf water masses with in-fjord water masses, and use these comparisons to actually identify at which depth we see modified waters. So that's kind of, you have the assumption that the water masses outside the fjord have not yet been influenced by these glaciers yet, and that's what enters the fjord. So you have some light water masses on the top, for example, polar water, and you have some denser water masses that enter the fjord at depth, typically Atlantic water in this region.
This is like the classical 2-layer thingy with the classical water, and then the
2-layer fjord.
Yeah.
And then there's some mixing with this fresh water, and by comparing these shelf and fjord profiles, we can see where there's a difference and where you get particularly a temperature and salinity signal, because the plume brings warm Atlantic water up in front of the glacier front. So these water masses closer to the surface are generally warmer in the fjord than on the shelf, because you have the upward mixing of Atlantic water. And that is really what we describe in detail on how to identify these layers of glacially modified water, because it's an important point that the export of fresh water, we know it occurs at some depth range, and this varies from fjord to fjord, depends on the glacier, depends on the plume, but it also varies in time. You cannot say that it's constant. And this is something that we showed, that the depth range of the water in the water mass in the fjord that contain these fresh waters from the glacier, that varies from year to year. And that's important while taking into account.
Right. And then as far as I understood it, you're basically taking the end members that you're having, like the subglacial water, the meltwater, the Atlantic water, the polar water, and then you do something that is called, I have to look that up, an optimum multi-parameter analysis, where you basically say your modified water that exits the fjord, the thing we are interested in, is composed of like a fraction of end member 1, end member 2, and so on. And then based on the data, you just basically find the optimal fractions for each end member to find out like how your glacially modified water is composed.
Yes, exactly. Right. So this is like, it's kind of a method paper in such that, of course, we describe how these processes are occurring in Upernavik, but the methods we present there, they should be applicable to other fjords. And the interesting part here is that by using these methods, we can not only find out at which depth the Atlantic water, but also we can find out its composition. So like how much, so we have this glacially modified water, which is exported from the fjord. How much of that is actually meltwater? How much is subglacial discharge? How much is Atlantic water? And how much is polar water? And typically, this is a method that's been used with noble gases, but what we do is that we have these data from multiple years. So we kind of treat temperature and salinity from the various years as independent. So we're kind of looking, because otherwise, since we have more water masses than we have properties, we only have temperature and salinity. So for one single year, you could not solve this system because we have more source waters.
It's an underdetermined system. You have more.
It's an underdetermined system.
Points, yeah.
But if we look at the whole data set in total, so like we have 6 years of temperature and salinity data, and we treat them as independent, that way we can calculate the composition from year or all these years, and then see, okay, well, your glacially modified water is composed of so many percentage Atlantic water, so many percent polar water.
Shall we give the real numbers? Because I think like the numbers that came out are like really, really nice. So it was like more than half Atlantic water, wasn't it? Like I'm just reading them out now, right? It's like 58% Atlantic water, and then we have 41% polar water. This is like the top layer. And then we have 1% subglacial discharge and 0.2% submarine meltwater. And this is kind of the fraction like that comes out, the composition. And that's like our challenge as modelers to live up to that and try to get the same stuff out as you have observed, right?
Exactly. And that's the important thing here, thinking about, because what comes out of the fjord isn't only, of course, there's fluxes going back and forth all the time, but that this meltwater and the subglaciers, it's heavily diluted. So we have less than 1% is like the composition of this newly formed water mass is meltwater and subglacial discharge. This is consistent with studies from noble gases that this dilution is really critical, but that's also, if you think about it, that the properties of the water mass that's exported from the fjord, of course, varies with the properties of the various end members. And since these end members are mainly the ambient water masses, that means that, you know, if you have warmer Atlantic water entering the fjord, it's also warmer glacially modified water exiting the fjord. So thinking about these connections, you kind of look at the freshwater input as a pump, but what sets the properties of the water mass that are exported from the fjord is really also what's being imported into the fjords. So the melting, the plume, that's really what drives this kind of estuarine-like circulation. And then you have what comes out of the fjord is scaled linearly.
very briefly, Estrin circulation, for those who are not familiar with that, is basically this two-layered exchange flow that you have like warm but dense water going in, and then the surplus of like fresh light water from the glacier side goes out at the top. So you have like this two-layered exchange flow, what we call Estrin circulation. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yes, no, so I think that's really the interesting part, and that this dilution in the fjord is important because if we see that water is distributed over a certain depth range, and that is usually not included in the models. And also, of course, comes with, or it sets up this circulation that's also not included in the models. Like there's a flux, a volume flux related to this, which is much larger than the initial input of, for example, subglacial discharge.
Yeah, so it really makes sense for like models. I mean, we're making a huge mistake by just dumping like fresh water at the surface, where we actually should have it like diluted over a depth range of, what was it, like a couple of 100 meters, where it exits then. Yeah, so
of course there are some simplifications. Like one of the major thing here is that we assume that the like the mixing ratios or these fractions are constant over the years that we study, but we think this is relatively realistic because they're mainly dependent on the geometry of the fjord, the glacier, the plume, etc. These are things that don't change much over time, or at least on short time scales. And then we also did a sensitivity study to see, okay, how sensitive are the glacially modified water masses on changes in, for example, subglacial discharge volume or the melt rates at the glacier front, and they're not, which is also makes sense because it's a very small percentage of this fresh water is included. But of course, the input of subglacial discharge is important in setting up this circulation.
Okay, so like my main takeaway message from your paper was kind of, you found this glacially modified waters along isopycnals, and you figured out, at least for this fjord, for these 6 years that you're having, how it is like really composed. What are the end members? It's mostly Atlantic water, then polar water, and just like to a tiny fraction, it's the subglacial discharge, and to an even tinier fraction, the submarine melting in there. And that's then distributed over a whole depth range going out of the fjord. And for me, this is just a brilliant starting point to think about. Once we can calculate what happens at the glacier, we still need to parameterize what happens in the fjord before we can dump all this water in the ocean to get everything, I don't want to say right, but better.
And an ideal parameterization should then have as inputs, for example, you have the oceanic conditions on the shelves, you have all your geometric constraints from your fjord, your glacier characteristics. These are all things that don't change. Then you have your glacial inputs, which you can get from glacial models, like your subglacial discharge, and put all of those together. And then what you get is, first of all, your melt rates. So that's how much, given a certain amount of subglacial discharge and ocean conditions, how much do you melt? And then what comes out of the fjord based on that? So what is the volume flux of the water mass that comes out, and what are its properties and at which depths? So both the inflows and the outflows. And these are the things that then should be included in the model, not only just the fresh water.
If people are now super interested in the study, it's published March 2022, so yesterday, in JPO, right?
Journal of Physical Oceanography, yes, JPO.
Yeah, nice.
Open access, and also the data
great.
is all open access. So I think it's also important to, of course, well, thank you for doing this interview, but also thank you to all the co-authors that contributed to this study, the colleagues at Scripps, Institute of Oceanography, University of Bergen, University of Edinburgh, and so forth. And also really acknowledge the great data provided by the NASA OMG project that we'll also add a link to.